Hello and welcome to the shed. In today's video I want to talk to you a little bit about what to look out for when buying old or vintage hand planes, whether on the internet or in person, and whether it's a metal bodied, wooden bodied, or a combination of both. From what you can see down here, I have quite a large collection of hand planes. I've been collecting them for a while. I sort of collect them, but then obviously I restore them and use them like a lot of the ones you've seen me use in various videos and do videos on restoring. But I obviously have a lot more here that I haven't restored. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do sort of an overview, things that are specific to all of these types of hand planes, and then we'll jump into a few more of the nuanced things when it comes to the metal bodied and transitional hand planes, and then some very specific things just to the wooden bodied hand planes. So let's jump in here and we'll start with an overview of just the general things, and I'll try and show you some close-ups of the various things that I'm talking about. So the first thing to look out for when it comes to a hand plane is to check your photos over and see that it actually has all its parts. Now I know when you've got very dirty planes like this, like it can be a little bit difficult to see what's there, but if the person's gone to an effort to at least take the lever cap off and show you the frog and sort of this sort of part, and you can see a back photo that shows the depth adjuster, and that it actually has its blade, its chip breaker, and its lever cap, and also the screw here, and that you can obviously see the screws for the frogger here, and that it has its two handles. They're the main things you want to look for. You want to have all those parts. Now you might notice this one doesn't have a lateral adjuster. That's alright, these earlier ones didn't. This is actually the same as the one that I've already restored up on the wall. It's a second one, which happens to be a Type 6. So the next thing, after checking that it's got all its parts, I'm very critical of looking at how long I'm going to be able to use the hand plane. Is it worth its price? So how much blade does it actually have left? Now, if we look at this one, we can see the blade only comes up a little bit past the top of the chip breaker here. So, and I'll lift this out in a minute so we can have a look. But then you can see these other ones up here, the blade comes, we can see part of the lateral adjuster on this one. But if we look at these ones, we can see that the lateral adjuster is completely covered, which means this is almost a brand new full-length blade. So let's just compare that. So we'll look at this number 3 here. So that's only got 18 millimeters of blade length left, and in all reality, you're probably only going to be able to use maybe 5 mil of that before it gets too close, and then it's not going to work quite as well as you would hope. So this one's not exactly the best buy in terms of the length of blade. However, when it does come to number 3s, their blades are a lot cheaper to buy brand new, to get replacements, and sometimes even vintage ones. So that's one of the reasons I still went for this, and I think I picked this one up only for 20 bucks, so that's a pretty good purchase. Now, if we look at one of these ones that has the blade coming right up over the top of the lever cap, if we look at this, we can see that this has 51 millimeters of blade length. If we look here, 51 millimeters. So that's almost a brand new blade. Now let me just grab a brand new blade out. I've got a vintage brand new set down here, so let me grab one of those and I'll show you what it has as brand new. Now I was lucky enough to pick these ones up a while ago, but if we look at the length here, about 52, 53 millimeters. And we can see that it comes up in line with the lateral adjuster just up the top here. It's handy to know how much blade these have and where they're going to sit, so you can judge roughly how much blade they have. Even if the blade is not taken out and you don't see a photo of it directly, you've got a good understanding of how much blade or cutting time you're going to have with that blade. Now, another thing to watch out, and that can be how much curve you actually have in your chip breaker here. Now, see this vintage new one. Look how much gap is in there. There's a huge hump compared to these. So what happens with these vintage style chip breakers over time, they can squish down, and I have had one or two over the time that I've been collecting them where there's not enough spring left in the chip breaker for it to actually make an even, clean surface. Even though I fit it correctly, and I will leave the video on how to fit chip breakers correctly down below, But even with them fitted correctly, if they don't have enough of a hump here, and some of them are really smoothed out and they've been squished down with the lever caps being done up too tight and maybe just some general abuse, I'm not quite sure. But they can come in and they're almost flat, so they actually don't spring, and they certainly don't have as much spring as this one has here. Now, yes, some of them you can actually re-spring them back to where the screw is, but sometimes that just doesn't work. There's just not enough curvature left in this hump part of the chip breaker for it to actually work. And the only other option with one of those is, if you pick it up cheap, is to get a replacement modern chip breaker for the most part, because it's hard to get these old style chip breakers brand new, at least here in Australia. Blade lengths kind of apply even to the wooden planes, so let me just release this wedge. Obviously, we've still got a similar amount of full depth here. It's harder to judge with these ones how much blade is left, but you do definitely want a good section of it coming out past your wedge. So when your wedge sits in here, a lot of them, the blade will come up here. If it's in behind it like this, this still has a decent amount of blade on it, but it's harder to judge based on that, because some of them have larger wedges, some of them have shorter wedges, but they've got the same sort of length blades. But if they have had a new piece of cutting steel added to the bottom of the blade with the forged blades, then the length can be a little bit off. So that one's one where you really want to be able to see the blade, in my opinion. With the wooden hand planes, you want to actually view that blade. And transitionals, well, they're identical to our metal body, but they've got a wooden sole. So they have all the same parts. They have the lateral adjuster, the blade, the chip breaker, the depth adjustment wheel, screws, and in this case they're wooden screws. If we have a look down here, they're wooden screws on this little short frog here that holds it to the wooden base. So now I want to move into a little bit more of the specifics surrounding what you can find with metal-bodied hand planes and what to look out for. I don't actually have any examples because I've avoided them, so yeah, I don't actually have any, but I want to show you what to look for because I have seen a number of them, especially online. The first thing we want to be looking for is anything around the mouth here. Any cracks on these corners. If it's been dropped, it's common to see cracking around here, especially if it's been dropped on the toe like that. It can crack just in here, and because this is the narrowest point of the casting, sometimes they can just crack if they've been abused and not looked after. The other thing to look out for is any cracking along the edge of the wings here, anywhere, and just along this edge along here, because that can be indicative of maybe it's been dropped and damaged. And if they have been dropped and cracked, they usually crack up on the side of the wing here as well, and you might see some copper or brass along this edge here that's been used to braze it back together, because it's hard to weld cast iron, and it's even harder to bring them back together whether you're brazing or not and actually get them back in alignment, because they tend to break really jagged, and so they never come together particularly clean after that. So that's just something to be aware of there. But the other thing with this, the actual sole of these, don't be too worried about a lot of dirt and things, although that can make it harder to see if there is, and sometimes you've just got to make it on a case-by-case basis. I've taken a gamble on some planes and they've been fine. If you do find a place that you trust and you've got them from a number of times and you know that they're always going to come back in good condition, say a buyer online or something, that's actually not a bad thing to have, because then you don't have to be quite so diligent in checking them over, but I'd still check them over. Now, the other thing you want to look at is any more cracking or anything anywhere up under where the frog is, anything like that. It's not common, but I have seen it a couple of times where there's a little bit of cracking in the mouth under where the frog assembly sits, so in here. So obviously this is one I haven't restored. It's not been stored in the best of conditions. It's very rusty, but under here where the frog sits, there's a raised part quite often, and sometimes I've seen a little bit of cracking in around that and around the screw threads there. So it's just something to watch out for. If the wrong screws have been put in there because it's cast iron, I think sometimes that can crack where the screws sit. So that's just something else to look out for. So now I want to look at something that can be common to the metal ones. It's very common on your metal hand planes, but not so much on the wooden ones, although it can happen. And that is, we're going to start looking at the knobs and the totes. So we can see this one clearly. One thing to watch out for is damage to these front knobs. Because they're circular and the grain is generally running in one direction, obviously, or hopefully it is. If they split, they tend to split right apart and they're hard to bring back together. Now, don't know if you can see on this one, this one has actually been repaired. I managed to get a little bit of super glue in this crack and then actually bring it back together. Although I haven't restored this one yet, I saw that there was that little split down, so I glued that back together just so it doesn't want to split further until I get around to restoring it, which I'm hopefully going to be doing a restoration on this one here on YouTube coming up in the near future. So I think this is a great one to do due to it being a Type 6, so it's an early pre-lateral adjust. Just on another note, just going back to the chip breaker, if we look at this one, we can see how flat this one is. There's almost no hump, and this one is going to be very difficult to actually get it to fit right. It might still work, sometimes they still do, but that's just something that you do want to keep an eye on when choosing. And you can see when I was talking about how flat they can get, there's almost no hump left in this one. It is well over 100 years old, so it's like 1850s or something like that. So yeah, it's been around the block, but it is something to watch out for. Looking at the rear tote on these, we can see the horn missing on the top. That's very common that this bit chips off. Now, this is the carbon copy of that plane, and I actually repaired it, so you can see it's actually not a difficult repair. It's a little bit fiddly, but you can repair them quite easily, so it's just something to watch out for, although it is a little annoying and fiddly to repair. So if you can get a hand plane that's got that intact, it's a little bit easier. The other thing that's very common in these, especially if they're being dropped on their handle or on their side, is splitting and cracking. And I don't know if you can see that on the back here, but this has got a big old split right around the middle. The carbon copy of this one that I had the same thing. It's very, very, very common. Generally, if there's no timber missing, you can actually just clamp them together with a bit of glue and they'll go straight back together, and you'll actually have no problems. But it is just something else to look out for, that if you're not going to want to do a whole bunch of work and just get into using it, because without that little hook here, it is harder to use these. They weigh down. The weight is supposed to be sort of taken on the top of that, and if it's split here, the whole thing can be moving around, so you will have to glue that back together. So it's just something to watch out for. Maybe you want to just make new handles for a hand plane, and that is also a valid option, which I might look at doing here in the future. But for now, look for any cracks and splits in the handle, especially when it's cracked multiple times. If it's just cracked and split in one spot, you can glue that together, it's usually okay. But if it happens in multiple spots through there, it can be very difficult to bring the whole thing back together. So it's just something you do want to watch out for. So that's most of what I could think about with the metal body, so I want to move into the wooden hand planes. Now, these are obviously very simple, but there's still quite a few things that can go wrong with one of these. So let me grab the other wooden hand plane and we'll talk about it. The very first thing you want to make sure they've got is a wedge. And if you've got it in person, you want to see that these wedges are actually fitting tight and that they are actually the correct wedge for the hand plane that you've got. Because it's quite common that people out there, especially on eBay, they'll just find a random wedge and put it with a hand plane and it doesn't go with it and it won't actually hold the blade the way you want. Other thing to look at along with that is that they actually have these little tangs in that they're not snapped off. So the reason being there is the wedge comes in over the top like this and it sits roughly about here. And it's putting the pressure down on the chip breaker, assuming it is a double blade. So you do get some of these old ones which are just a single blade, so no chip breaker. But when you've got the chip breaker, or whether you don't or not, it comes down roughly to this point here. What that's doing is on these little cheeks in here, it puts pressure from the wedge onto the blade and jams it in against the bottom to stop it moving. So this is vital to the operation and vital to hold the blade in place. If you're missing these, and I do have one over there somewhere where it's missing these, the blade's going to move and it doesn't actually hold it. Now, in some cases you can repair it, But the reason these are very common in snapping off is how narrow and thin they are. Just in the operation of the hand plane and how it works, they need to be thin and narrow and off the side and not block the shaving coming through. And so it's very common that they snap if someone's not paying attention when the way they put the wedge in, and then they lock it into place by hitting it with a hammer. It can snap them off if it's not in the right alignment. If you've got the blade in there the wrong way around and things like that, you can jam it in there and you can damage them. And in some cases, these cheeks here can even be split and broken off. Now, I have one hand plane that did have that, and I actually glued them back in place. It's the big long jointer plane up the top here. So I'm not going to get that down right now, but those had split off. I don't know if it's because it wasn't oiled properly, but they had split off and there was a gap there, so I ran glue in them and clamped them back, and luckily they held in place. But that is something that you do want to look. You want to look down in the guts of your wooden hand plane. I know there's not much to them, but you want to make sure these cheeks are intact and that everything is nice and smooth and no serious cracking or splitting in around there. Now, I've shown you how to remove the stuck blades in these before, but you can see how there's little splits running in here, and that can be through wood movement of these shrinking. You've got the blade in here, you've got the wedge in here, it's under tension, and that's why you should always store these a little bit loose so any wood movement is not going to jam that blade in the mouth there, because if that gets through here like this and it shrinks onto it, it'll split the timber because the timber's got nowhere to go because it's shrunk against it, and it will cause splitting or little checking like you see here. Now, this one still functions fine. The other thing that I had happen to this since it's been in my shop is extra checking on the end here. This wasn't here initially. It's possible it was there and it's opened up since it's been in my workshop, but every workshop has a different sort of humidity in that, and so wood movement is different, and that's just something that you really have to watch out for when you buy these wooden hand planes, because they're very attractive for their pricing and they work very well. They've been used for thousands of years. The design hasn't really changed, but that is just some things that you need to look for with the wooden bodied hand planes. So another thing is just to look at the general condition of the hand plane. How bad is it? How good is it? And the like. You want to be looking for a lot of damage in this area. Is going to be indicated that it's been used a lot in this fore area, because that's one of the areas where you'll strike. Some of them have a striking button here because these were always used or hit with a claw hammer, and that's why you'll see, like on this one here, a lot of damage to the actual top of the wedge, because obviously metal hammers damage wood. Other spot is on the back here. Likewise, some of them have a striking button or a metal button that's here, but a lot of hammer strikes, you can see on the back here, there's some circles, and that's from a metal hammer hitting it. I generally use my nylon faced hammer to do that, so it doesn't tend to damage it, but historically metal claw hammers were used. Another thing to look out for with the wooden planes is how wide open the mouth is here. Now, you can repair them with a filler block to close that mouth up, but sometimes they can get much larger than even what this one is here. And I do have one there where the mouth is open about this far, about twice the size it needs to be, so you'd have to add a filler block back in there, and that's an indication that the plane has been used a lot. There's been a lot of flattening of it done regularly over time, and it's worn the sole of the block down, and so in some cases it might be necessary for you to come and put another piece of timber on here, recut that mouth open to close it up, or you can put that filler block in there if it's not far enough that you'd require to resole it. But there are two options. It's very common to see little filler blocks in, especially on these smoothers, because they're the ones that you want to have a nice tight mouth on as your smoother, and so it's very common to see little filler blocks added back in here to close that mouth up so you get a nice fine shaving even in the most figured timbers. Along with talking about the sole there, that's also very common on these, that if the transitional hand plane was used a lot, this sole could be worn down, that mouth can be really open, and we have the advantage here that the entire thing is timber, so we could replace the entire sole on this, or you could still add a filler block like I was suggesting with the wooden ones, the fully wooden ones. So that's just another option. And with the transitional and wooden ones, you also need to look out for handle breakage. If they've been dropped on them, that can break them as well, obviously, but these are a little bit harder to glue back together because they're still attached. Some of your transitionals have a handle here that's actually screwed in or into the back here, and so the totes and handles, wooden parts, is always something to look at. But because it is timber, it's much easier for us to repair it than if we have damage to the metal, which you just can't repair. So I think that pretty much covers everything that I can think of that I look for when it comes to buying any type of vintage hand plane, whether it's a transitional, a metal, or a wooden bodied. And sometimes you do just have to take a gamble, and sometimes it might not pay off. But where possible, do your due diligence. If it's on eBay, do ask for more photos if you think you need some additional photos. Usually they're willing to go give you some extra photos so you can have a good look at what it is that you're purchasing, and so you can actually make your right choice. Because most of them aren't out there to scam you, in my opinion. They just want to sell the tools they've got, and they might be unaware, they might not know a lot about them. They might be selling relatives hand planes and tools, so they might just be completely unaware, and that's something you do just have to bear with. It's just part of the whole purchasing hand planes online. Obviously, where possible, in person is going to be far better, and the vast majority of the hand planes I've got here, I have picked up in person off Facebook Marketplace and just the local swap meet markets on a Sunday here in Perth. And so you generally can see one or two, a lot of hand saws at those, but hand planes, I do pick them up quite regularly for around that $20 to $35, and be prepared to haggle on them, and you should be able to get a pretty decent price for a hand plane to restore, but you do want to make sure that you actually check it over properly first. On the whole, I found that most of the hand planes I've found are in, well, restoring is required. They're missing paint, they're missing finish on the handles, they need a good clean up and a de-rust, all of which is a very simple and easy thing to do. It's just those things that we can't repair that you want to look out for, and if you don't want to spend the time doing it, you need to be a little more careful and look out for these other things that I've mentioned along the way that mean that the hand plane is not going to function as well as you would like when you first get it. So there you have it, folks. I think I've covered everything here, all the topics and parts of things to look out for when purchasing, you know, used hand planes online, whether it's the metal, the transitional, or the wooden. They all work well, these hand planes, when set up correctly, but you do want to just watch out for some of these things, which is things that we can't repair and can't take care of ourselves to bring it back into a functioning order. So that's really what you're looking for. Any catastrophic damage to the plane that means that you're going to have to either chuck that plane and just keep it for parts, or not be able to use it, and you don't want to have that feeling of getting all excited about buying your first hand plane to restore and then finding out that you made a mistake in purchasing it, and that turns you off buying vintage planes, because vintage planes are great, and I want to encourage you all to try and get out there and buy them at decent prices and restore them to save yourself money so you don't have to go out buying brand new hand planes. Obviously, I have a few recommendations on brand new ones, but on the whole, I prefer using the vintage ones or old ones where possible. So if you like this video, please do like and subscribe down below. While you're down there, do sound off in the comments. Is there something that you look out for when buying these vintage hand planes that I didn't mention here, or maybe something I hadn't even considered that you think is vital, or maybe even not so vital, but something that might be important for someone to be aware of? If you'd like to see another great video, such as one you've seen here today, do check out the video up here where I show you the fastest, quickest, and easiest way that I know to restore an old hand plane. Bye for now.